on climate injustice. So now for the next 15 minutes, we're going to speak about climate injustice and why the climate crisis is not just a biophysical crisis, but also a social justice crisis. And this is because the responsibility for the emissions and the burden of the climate risks are unevenly distributed across multiple levels. So we're going to look at different levels where climate injustice exists across countries, across income groups, ethnicities, genders, as well as generations. So if we look at these three maps, what we can see is that the responsibility for causing climate change and vulnerability to its effects are mismatched. So if we look at the first map, it shows CO2 emissions per capita or per person. So if a country is colored in dark red, that means they have higher CO2 emissions. And if they're yellow and orange, they have lower CO2 emissions. To the right of that map, you can see vulnerability mapped. So vulnerability to the climate change is the predisposition to be negatively affected by climate risks. And you can see if countries are colored in red, they have higher vulnerability. And if they're colored in green or yellow, they have lower vulnerability to climate change. If we look at these two maps, we can see that countries that are emitting the highest amount of CO2, so contributing to climate change the most, are also those who are least vulnerable to its effects. And another factor that is here is the wealth of nations. So on the map on the right, far right, the blue one, we can see GDP per capita or gross domestic product per capita, which notes the income levels and how wealthy nations are. We're going to refer to nations according to their kind of how developed they are or their income levels as global north and global south. So we can see in the global north, so North America, Europe, Australia, that there is high GDP per capita. What this means for climate change is that countries who have more resources, so wealthier nations, are able to adapt to climate change risks better because they have more resources to invest in disaster risk reduction measures and reacting when climate hazard does happen. So as such, countries with less resources are more vulnerable to climate change. And here lies the global patterns of climate injustice. However, when we look at historical patterns of climate injustice, we can see that the pattern is even clearer. So, Andrea, I don't know if you want to play this video, but it basically shows the responsibility for climate emissions, I think from 2002 to 2015, or maybe even earlier. I think maybe it's from the Industrial Revolution. But anyway, what we see is that countries that currently emit the highest amounts of CO2 are also those that have historically emitted the highest amounts of CO2. And these histories of CO2 emissions are also intertwined with political histories. So colonizing powers that have industrialized early by exploiting fossil fuels at home, they have extracted also raw materials, labor, and land from colonies, which resulted in creating this vast wealth in Europe and North America, while leaving behind environmental damage, poverty, and vulnerability in the colonized regions. And this is important because of the maps we just looked at, but also because these historical patterns of inequality in power also reflect today. So agency and voices in decision-making spaces are influenced by history. So history shapes the power and inequality that we see today. And let's look at an example now of how a flood impacted two countries, one country being Germany, so really a global north high-income country, and Pakistan. So in Germany, a flood happened, it affected 40,000 people, and the damage and economic costs of this floods were around $40 billion US. Germany was able to mobilize funds really quickly for flood relief and for reconstruction. So $35 billion US was mobilized within weeks of the disaster. If we compare this to Pakistan, where a flood happened and impacted 33 million people, causing $30 billion in damages. But the funding that this country was able to activate was much lower, and it required much longer time. So international donors collected $8.5 billion compared to the 40 billion in Germany, even though millions and millions of more people were affected. And this funding was aimed for the next 3 years. And in practice, this means that people living in Pakistan had to suffer the consequences of the floods for much longer, not being able to rebuild and recover after the flood happened. But injustices don't only exist between countries, they also exist within one country. So, and the thing is that these patterns of inequality that we see, climate change makes them worse. So let's look at responsibility and vulnerability again. Wealthy individuals emit far more. So the richest, as you can see in the graph on the left, the richest 10% are responsible for 50% of the world's emissions, while the poorest 50% are responsible for around 8% of global emissions. So we can really see the disparity here within responsibility. And this is because of lifestyles. So wealthy individuals have lifestyles that are that have higher consumption of luxury goods, more holidays, multiple homes, especially of the ultra rich or the kind of 1%. And it's not only that these lifestyles are very carbon intensive, it is also that they shape our mindset and goals. So these highly consumptive lifestyles are actively promoted by corporations and industries and celebrities' ideas of good life, where success is seen as having high income, as constantly traveling, having large homes, and having endless consumer goods. And this creates really powerful social imaginaries. But these imaginaries are at the end of the day unsustainable, and they benefit corporations and their shareholders while driving climate breakdown. And who bears the consequences of this climate breakdown? Mostly lower income people, or they bear higher, they're more vulnerable to its effects. Why? Because they have less resources to recover after something happens. So let's say a flood happens, there is a high income household that can quickly renovate their homes, replace all the damaged items, while a low income household doesn't have the means to do this and will take much longer to recover from the impact of the flood. But it's not only vulnerability, it is also exposure. So exposure means that how likely you are to kind of be exposed to a climate hazard. So, for example, one study found that in 73% of the countries studied, poor urban households were more exposed to floods. So they were living in areas of their city where a flood is more likely to happen. And it is also that houses, for example, in informal settlements are built of materials that are more prone to damage from climate hazards. And as you can see in the image of the right, this also has to do with both vulnerability and exposure. So the neighborhood on the left, the homes there likely don't have air conditioning, so they're vulnerable to the effects of heat wave, but also because it's 60 degrees hotter, they're more exposed kind of to the heat wave as well. While the neighborhood on the right probably has air conditioning, lives near green spaces, and so on. But economic inequality is not the only factor that makes people more vulnerable to climate change. It is also the intersections of economic inequalities and other inequalities of power, such as gender and ethnicity. So, for example, women, especially those with lower socioeconomic status, tend to have less access to relief and assistance, which results in them having lower survival rates and reduced life expectancies following a climate disaster. For example, they can be excluded from safe shelters and early warning systems, or may struggle to evacuate during a climate disaster because they're taking care of children and elderly relatives as well. The intersection, this also stands for indigenous people. So indigenous people, both in the global north and the global south, suffer disproportionately from climate hazards. This is because of a few things. Firstly, it's because their livelihoods are directly dependent often on natural resources, which again directly depend on weather and climate variations. And it is also because of politic and economic marginalization. Indigenous people are 6% of the global population, but 19% of the extreme poor. They also face systemic racism and discrimination, which means that they don't have voices in decision-making processes and spaces, which includes risk governance. And they, because of all of this, they often lack access to relief and disaster response and rebuilding support after a climate disaster does happen. This is also because of many indigenous land are still not recognized. So indigenous people are not the recognized owners of their lands, which means that when their lands do get impacted by climate hazards, they don't get compensation or protection. For museums, these different levels of inequality and how they intersect with climate change means that when museums do speak about climate change and within their exhibitions and programs, they should bring attention to these experiences of women, indigenous peoples, and communities living in poverty in order to extend climate action from a narrow view on CO2 emissions and simply reducing carbon emissions to tackling these social aspects and social injustices as well. Another view of climate injustice is the generational injustice, so injustice on timescales. And this is because while older generations are responsible for causing climate change, it is young people, especially those yet to be born, that will live through the worst consequences of climate change. So younger generations will face more extreme heat waves, floods, and droughts than their parents and grandparents ever experienced or imagined. So for example, people born in 2020, so people who are now 5, will experience between 2 and 7 times more extreme weather events compared to people born in 1960. And maybe it's because of these patterns of injustices that we've been through. So at the global level, at the national level, at the generational levels, explains why global South countries like the Pacific Islands, women, indigenous people, and younger people are often at the forefront of climate action. So they not only fight for their livelihoods, but also for those of generations yet to come. But they shouldn't stand alone. And we need institutions like museums to join the movement. And just to end this slide on a Native American proverb that says, "We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children." So maybe have that in mind when you think about your relationship to nature, to each other, and to your own work. One more thing we wanted to draw your attention to is kind of as a concluding factor, the importance of justice in addressing the climate crisis. And this is recognized at the international level by the IPCC, who is the leading global scientific institution with expertise on climate change. It is also recognized by the European Union through this framework of a just transition. So according to the IPCC, this is refers to the set of principle, processes, and practices aiming to ensure that no people, workers, places, sectors, countries, or regions are left behind in the move from a high carbon to a low carbon economy. So this means that as we transition from a high CO2 society to a renewable energy society, we have to make sure that justice is centered. But how is it going so far? Well, basically what we see with the current green energy transition is that there are some issues and some systemic inequalities being replicated. So the renewable energy transition requires a lot of minerals, such as lithium, cobalt, graphite, and so on. And these minerals have to be mined from somewhere. They are mainly concentrated in Latin America and Africa, but the demand is skyrocketing. So it's expected that the demand for lithium, cobalt, and graphite will increase by 40% until 2040. And while these resources are vital for the renewable energy we have, we can see the same social and ecological injustices being perpetuated as during fossil fuel extraction. And this refers to land grabbing, water depletion, dispossession of indigenous and peasant lands, biodiversity loss, pollution. And this is done in a way that usually countries in the global south or marginalized communities in the global north suffer the ecological and social consequences of mining, which we all know are devastating, while the countries and, I mean, corporations in global north benefit. And this is referred to as green extractivism. So we are already seeing patterns of green extractivism across the world. For example, in the lithium triangle, which is located in Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia, where local communities are resisting this expansion of lithium mining, but the demand is really, really high. And these patterns can also be seen on this map. But for a just green transition, we really have to make sure that human rights are met, inequalities are addressed, and that we don't perpetuate the existing patterns of inequality. And in part, what this will require is rethinking our economies and beyond endless growth to economies where everyone's needs are being met while also the environment is protected. And the museums do have a role here. This means that engaging with climate action isn't just about raising awareness of rising temperatures. It's about showing how climate change is rooted in histories of colonialism and how it is currently exacerbating present inequalities. Museums can, by leveraging the power of art, cultural heritage, and education, cause emotional responses. And we know that emotions can turn facts into felt experiences, and emotions can make people really act. And I'd like to end on that note. And so because this part about climate injustice can stir up a lot of emotions, I think I would like to take 5 minutes now to reflect on some emotions that this presentation might have caused. So I'm going to read out some statements, so some facts, and I'd like to ask you, how do they make you feel? To answer me, I'd like to ask you to write the answers in the chat, but don't send them until you get my cue. So I'll give you around 30 seconds to just write the first thing that you feel. And on my countdown, I'll say 3, 2, 1, send. And I'd like all of you to send it at the same time. So we'll have a chat shower of emotions and we can see how many overlap. So the first statement is that a private jet emits as much as 177 cars annually. 2/3 of all private jets have departed from the US in 2023. In the same year, frequent private jet flyers emitted 500 times more than the average person in a year. How does this make you feel? So in the next 30 seconds, please write in the chat. Wait for my cue to send it, please. And if everyone's written what they feel, I'd like you to send it in 3, 2, 1, send. It's too late to wake up now, doomed. Doom and gloom. So angry, not surprised, unfair, Taylor Swift at fault. Angry. There's a Latvian saying, the rich do what they want, the poor do what they can. Angry. Impotent. Okay, so we have, I think, a lot of anger building up, which I think is a very fair emotion. Inequalities lead to harm for humans and nature. Exactly. So human ecology and social inequalities are, I think, inseparable issues. Let's go to the next few statements. 4 out of 10 people exposed to flood risk live in poverty. So 780 million flood-exposed people live in less than $5.5 a day, while 170 million flood-exposed people live in extreme poverty, which means that they have less than $1.90 a day. Again, I'll give you 30 seconds to write, and then on my signal to please paste your feelings. 3, 2, 1. Paste, please. Somehow guilty. So unfair. Sad and anger. Sad and again unfair. Unfair. I'm lucky to not be among them. Again, privileged land for the privileged, the poor are left with their remains. We cannot entertain, it's too late to fantasy here because we will not be hit first. That is, I mean, all the feelings that you put in, I really agree with. And I think a lot of people, that's why education is important, which we will also speak about in the next presentation. Because when you hear these things, it brings emotions that can then lead into action. But I think gratitude and reflecting on that is also an important part. Okay, last few statements, please. And this one is about intergenerational injustice. According to a UNICEF report published in 2024, by 2050, which is in 25 years, not that long to go, 8 times more children will be exposed to heat waves, 1.7 times more children will be exposed to wildfires, 3 times more children exposed to floods, 1.3 times more children exposed to droughts, and 1.2 times more children will be exposed to cyclones. How do these facts about intergenerational injustice make you feel? Three, two, one, please paste. Feeling sorry for mothers, their kids will go through this. Makes me feel guilty about wanting kids in the future. Alvin, I can relate to that. We can't allow this to happen. Worried about the future, my children, my grandchildren, sadness. This will be the world where my daughter will grow up. We must defend the weak. I feel a strong responsibility to focus the work on this. Okay, Sarah, thank you. I like that your comment was last because it's also empowering and gives some hope. And it's not all doom and gloom, and focusing on how we can adapt to climate change and how we can really try to reduce CO2 emissions and work towards not getting these numbers even higher for the next generations is what we can do. Well, the next part is now shifting a bit from these emotions that we've now collected to what we can do. So we all feel angry and sad. Okay, let's see what we can do about this. So this third presentation is about systemic change and education for sustainable development goals. So what we have seen so far is that most solutions that address the climate crisis that have been implemented so far are not lowering CO2 emissions at the scale and speed that we need to avoid the worst impact of climate change. Based on the current policies that are implemented in countries, we are projected to reach 2.7 degrees warming by 2100. And what we have touched upon in our last presentation is that through addressing climate change, we can see that systemic inequalities are being replicated under the green transition. So, for example, when we look at the places where leading banks have invested into mining, we can see that these are places with weak regulations, so weak environmental regulations, that 70% of mines overlaps with indigenous or peasant lands, and that 71% are located in regions with high biodiversity. So these mining activities that are projected to happen or that are being planned to happen will have high social and ecological costs. So if you're disappointed that the current climate action is falling short of the challenge, I believe you're very much not alone, and you have reason to be. But this is because we're constantly trying to patch up a system that has clearly failed us in terms of social and ecological outcomes. And this is why we need systems change. So you can imagine driving a bicycle on a road that has a lot of potholes. And each time you hit the pothole, you patch up your tire. And you can stop and keep on patching up your tire, although your tire at one point will have too many holes to be fixed. Or you can change the whole road infrastructure and fixing all the potholes and making it good for cycling. And this is what systems change is. It's like changing the road infrastructure. But let's first see what a system is and what a system's thinking. So a system is a set of interconnected elements, which is like people, institutions, rules, technologies, or values that together create patterns and outcomes. So a system can have many subsystems that are part of it. For example, a museum is a system, but it's also a subsystem of a wider part of the system, which is cultural, educational, and social systems. And system thinking is a holistic way of understanding and analyzing these complex systems by looking at the relationships, interactions, and interdependencies of its parts, components, or these subsystems that I just mentioned. And it's a different way of looking at things because it doesn't focus on individual part, it more focuses on the whole picture. And it is a more kind of circular and messy way to look at things. But it is a better representation of reality because reality is quite messy and circular and complex. This iceberg model that you can see on the slide is a good way to help us think in a more systemic way, because it shows us that the iceberg, so the events of like some event, that's something that happened, is not just that. It is a result of a much bigger picture. So what's really going on is hidden behind the surface, and this includes patterns, structures, and beliefs that shape the single event that we see. And by looking deeper and by looking into these pattern structures and beliefs, we can understand why this event happened, and have a better understanding of the problem, and think of solutions that deal with the root causes and not are just simple and quick fixes to the problem. So reflecting back on museums, system thinking can help us see museums not just as buildings and people working with collections, but as actors in wider networks that have a potential to shape climate awareness and spread values like justice and human rights. Beyond exhibitions, museums can influence community learning, social values, memory, and foster public debate. When thinking about systems and thinking about how to cause systems change, it's important to know and think about leverage points. So leverage points are places within a system where a small change can trigger big transformations. And by identifying these leverage points, we can focus our interventions where they will be the most effective. So when we think about leverage points, it's asking, where can we intervene to create change? Different leverage points have different impacts and strengths. So some are deeper and more powerful, some are more shallow. So let's go through a few to see. So for example, rules, goals, and mindsets of a system. They're all leverage points. Rules of a system are mid-level leverage points. So that are things like formal regulations such as laws, policies, taxes, subsidies, but they're also informal. So some social rules that we have within our friendships, for example. And these are mid-level leverage points, especially the formal rules, because just because changing a rule doesn't mean that you're necessarily gonna change the whole system. So let's say you bring a carbon tax, which makes carbon-intensive products more expensive, and that is changing the rule of the economic system. But if nothing else changes and the whole economic system remains the same, those rules can be resisted, they can be overturned, they can be weakened through time or worked around. The goals, focusing on the goals, is much deeper. They define what the system is trying to achieve. For many economies currently, especially in the global north, the dominant goal of every economic system is constant GDP growth. And if that doesn't change, then other rules like carbon taxes or economic activities will continue working towards achieving economic growth as the central idea and central goal behind the system. And sustainability and climate action will be possible only if it as well meets this goal of economic growth, but it will never be central. Mindsets or paradigms are the deepest leverage points. And this is because they stand behind everything else. They underpin what we think is natural or normal. So they underpin our mindsets, underpin this idea of progress and seeing progress as economic growth. Or they underpin us seeing humans as separate and superior to nature. Or they underpin us seeing success as having high income and high consumptive lifestyles. But so if we don't change these mindsets and paradigms and center them around some other patterns, we will end up reproducing kind of the same outcomes. Another leverage point is education. Education is a deep leverage point because it can reach and change people's mindsets. So education influences how we see the world. So if climate change is thought like a very complex technical issues, it's a lot of focus on, like, let's say, climate models, people will see it as a problem for scientists and engineers to fix, and they won't want to engage with climate change. But if climate change education also includes perspectives of justice and culture and well-being, it can shift our mindsets and how we view it as an issue, and maybe eventually how we see the world. So people can start to see climate change as a shared social challenge that requires everyone to participate, that requires fairness, that requires cooperation, and at the end of the day, that requires systemic change. And this reframing opens up new solutions that we can think of. One example that we want to draw your attention to is the educational example of Mexico's intercultural universities. And it's an example of education trying to change mindsets. Indigenous communities and local communities around the world hold generations of ecological knowledge that has been passed on for hundreds of years. And because of this and their close relationship with the natural world, their practices and language hold invaluable information that we need for climate adaptation, and generally to kind of get ideas of how to get out of this environmental and climate crisis. But their languages and practices that are filled with this knowledge are under threat, and more than half of indigenous languages are at risk of disappearing. This is a huge cultural loss, but it is also a loss of knowledge that we require for the climate crisis. Mexico's intercultural universities were designed to address this gap. So what they do is they offer bilingual and culturally relevant education. They bring local wise people and traditional and indigenous knowledge holders into teaching. They place indigenous knowledge as Western science, giving Western science and indigenous knowledge the equal amount of strength. This model is also reflected in the idea of two-eyed seeing. So with one eye, you are seeing things with indigenous wisdom, and you use the other eyes to see things with a scientific approach. And only when you use both, you can see the full picture and get the solutions that we really need. What is really important is that the graduates from these universities often become bridges between their communities and policymakers and other stakeholders. So they help bring indigenous views into decision-making spaces. And these universities are systemic solutions because they challenge dominant narrative, which position Western science, which is only a few hundred years old, way above traditional ecological knowledge and generally traditional knowledge that has been built upon for thousands of years. And they also foster the preservation and transmission of indigenous languages, their worldviews, and ecological knowledge that are all critical to protect biodiversity and deal with the climate crisis. Because education is a leverage point, education for sustainable development is so important. Education for sustainable development empowers our learners to take informed decisions and responsible actors for environmental integrity, economic viability, and a just society for present and future generations. It is based on a model of learning that includes the head, heart, and hands. So cognitive, so learning about kind of facts, gaining new knowledge. Emotional, thinking about values and attitudes and how you feel towards the thing that you've learned. And behavioral, so acting at the end of it. So the point is to not only provide facts, such as how climate change happens, but to bring in sustainable development goals issues emotionally closer to people, and to see what we can do about it to contribute to just change. For example, for museums, it can be how to incorporate climate justice into activities. And the museums, again, have a big role in this because they can impact the deepest leverage point, which is shifting the mindsets and bringing new imaginaries of what our futures can look like and what we can do about it to the world. And with that, our last presentation on systemic change and education for sustainable development is done.